Welcome to the first lesson from Equity Tutors, and this lesson today is going to be on biological molecules. So just before we jump into the content, I just wanted to reiterate a few things that we spoke about in the introduction lesson. The main thing is I want to emphasize that this isn't an online tutorial. We don't want this to be just another YouTube video you watch or podcast you listen to learn the content. This is really meant to be as much of an interactive experience as we possibly can allow it to be. The intention is to emulate as much of a personal tutor experience as we can. So not just you sat there listening, absorbing information. We want this to be a two-way street. And the best way that you can do that is to also engage in our additional services. So as we mentioned in the last podcast, 30-minute lessons a week will be free. We are also providing on Patreon an additional 30 minutes after the end of each lesson where you can go over some practice questions with each of us. And then at the end of those sessions, I'll also be setting an essay question based on the topic, which you can then send to us, and we will mark those and give you feedback on those. So now let's get into biological molecules. So most A-level students will be starting their A-levels with this as the first topic, and that's across the board for whatever exam board you are studying under. So these are biological molecules which are not going to be unfamiliar to you. So they are water, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, etc. So they're not unfamiliar things. They're things that most of you will have studied at GCSE. So the useful thing about biological molecules is that they are conserved throughout nature. So what I mean by that is water, proteins, carbohydrates, fats are the same structure in a plant as they are in a bacteria, as they are in all animals. What that means for us is that you only need to learn the structure of a protein, for example, once, and that applies to all different types of proteins. And understanding structure function relationships is very important in this module. So what do I mean by this? And it's important for you to understand because this is the basis of many of the questions from this module, is relate the structure of X to the function of X. So for example, if I asked you to describe the structure of a frying pan and how that related to its function, you might say a frying pan is made out of metal, it's got a large surface area and a plastic handle. So how does the structure of a frying pan make the frying pan good for its job? So what is the job of a frying pan? Is to fry food. So number one, it's made out of metal because that will conduct heat and help warm up the food in the frying pan quick. Secondly, it's got a large surface area so you can cook a lot of food in there at the same time. And third, it has a plastic handle, and that's so a person pick up the frying pan and they don't get burnt. So the plastic insulates the metal in that area. So that's just an example of how you might structure those types of questions where they're asking you to relate the structure to the function. So we're going to start with water. And firstly, we're going to go over the structure of water. There are some images I'm going to be referring to. So if you are listening to a podcast, we are going to link those images below. If you're listening somewhere where there's also a video feature, we will be putting the images up on the video. So the first picture is just showing a molecule of water. So we have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen in the middle. So some of you may have be doing chemistry A-level, and some of you to varying degrees will have studied chemistry at GCSE. All you need to know is that there are shared electrons between the hydrogen and the oxygen. and those electrons sit closer to the oxygen than they do to the hydrogen. And electrons, as you probably know, are negatively charged. So what this means is that the oxygen is slightly negative and then makes the hydrogen slightly positive. So sometimes we refer to water as being polar. And what that means is just that it has more negative regions and positive regions. So essentially, water molecules are polarized like a magnet. And you've got multiple magnets together with a negative region and a positive regions, and the negative and positives come together, and those bonds are called hydrogen bonds. So now that we understand the structure of water, I want to talk about how the structure relates to the function and the properties of water. And this is especially important with water because water is the essence of life. Life could not exist without water. So for each property, I want you to think about how it plays a role in the fundamentals of biology and how our bodies work. So we're thinking of three things. We're thinking about the function, how the function relates to the structure, and how that function is relevant to biology. So two important properties to start with are cohesion and adhesion. And these properties are directly linked to what we've just discussed in terms of the structure of water, in that water is polar. So let's go back to our analogy of water being a magnet with one negative end and one positive end. Of course, when a magnet encounters another magnet, also with a positive and negative end, the positive and negative ends are attracted to each other. They stick to each other. Using that analogy, if we think that two molecules of water are both polar, they're both magnets, they're going to stick together. And when two molecules of water stick together, we call that cohesion. And adhesion is very similar, but we use the word adhesion when water molecules which are polar are attracted to other polar molecules. So they're sticky to other things which are not water. So this is a bit like how a magnet can stick to other stuff, not just other magnets. So a magnet will stick to other magnets, but it also sticks to magnetic things. So if you've got two magnets sticking together, that is cohesion. If the magnet is sticking to something else that is magnetic, that is adhesion. So in regards to cohesion, I want you to think about when you run a tap, you normally get a solid column of water. That is demonstrating how cohesive water is, all sticking together and is tightly packed in a neat column. Because of this cohesion, the surface tension at the water-air boundary is high. So what do I mean by the water-air boundary? So that is just a fancy way of saying the point at which the water and the air meet. So for example, if you're looking at the sea, it's the point at which the sea is no longer the sea and it's the sky, for example. That is demonstrating that the water is cohesive because the line between the two is clearly defined. So what you get is a high surface tension and a very distinct boundary between the water and the air. Then secondly, we have adhesion. And as I said, this is similar to cohesion, but this is referring to how water molecules stick to other sticky or polar molecules. I just want to say, don't use sticky instead of polar in an exam. I'm using sticky now for you to remember what I mean when I say an object is polar, but generally speaking, you want to use official words in exams. And this is something I'll go over in the follow-up lesson as well. So adhesion is when water is attracted to other polar objects and is able to form hydrogen bonds with other molecules and adhere to them. So through the strong cohesive and adhesive capacity of water, this then helps us understand more of water's functions and properties. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is that water is a solvent. So what do I mean by solvent? Solvent means that it's able to dissolve substances. So the solvent is the thing that the substances are dissolved into. For example, things like salt. You put a spoonful of salt in water or sugar in water and it'll dissolve very quickly. And this is because the water is polar. Remember, we want to talk about these points at 3 levels: related to its structure, explain how the structure helps with the function, and then finally explain how that function is relevant to our biology. So number 1, water is polar. Because it's polar, it's able to form hydrogen bonds with other molecules, allowing it to act as a solvent. So the next level is, why is water being a solvent important to biology? If you think about the fact that water is a major component of our cells, it means that lots of different substances, for example, can be present in our cytoplasm. They can interact with other substances, and this can possibly lead to metabolic reactions, some of which later on in the module, later on in the year, we will get into in more detail, so don't worry about these examples yet, but know that because water is a solvent, it can then be a site for metabolic reactions. It being a solvent, it also makes it a good transport medium. So what do I mean by good transport medium? So how are biological molecules transported around our body? In our blood, of course, which is also comprised of water. So since things are able to be dissolved in water and therefore our blood, biological molecules are able to be transported around the body. So for example, hormones are not necessarily always made in the place where they are needed. So these are transported around in our circulatory system in blood, where they are easily dissolved and able to be transported. So the second function I want you to remember is that water has a high heat specific capacity. So I understand those just sound like a bunch of random words put together, but unfortunately you do need to learn the official term. So it has a high heat specific capacity. So what I mean by this in normal English is that it means that the temperature of water is relatively stable. So as with each of these properties, we want to understand how this relates to the structure of water. So let's backpedal a little bit. Because water molecules stick together so strongly by hydrogen bonding, it means it takes a lot of energy or heat to break those bonds. So you need to break those bonds for water to vaporize. So when you think of when you boil a kettle, it takes a lot of heat, it needs to get to 100 degrees for the hydrogen bonds between the molecules to break. So what this means is that water is relatively stable under changes in temperatures. It takes a lot of energy, it takes it to get into 100 degrees or freezing for it to lose the properties that make it so unique and important to life. Think about the difference between that solid column of water I mentioned and then steam. It's no longer cohesive at all. So for it to lose that cohesion, a lot of energy needs to go into it. So we refer to this as high heat specific capacity. Why is this important to our biology? So as I'm sure you know, every chemical bond and every chemical reaction is sensitive to changes in temperature. A change in temperature of our body of even 1 degree can have a huge effect on our health. So everything in our body needs to be kept at very stable temperatures. And because of water's high heat specific capacity, it's actually very good at doing this job. So just to recap, water has a high heat specific capacity. This is because the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules are strong and it takes a lot of energy to break those hydrogen bonds. This is important to our biology because we need to keep our bodies at a stable temperature. The next property is that water has a relatively large latent heat of vaporization. I'm going to say that again. Large latent heat of vaporization. Again, unfortunately, you need to learn the official term. So what this means in normal English is that when water evaporates, it provides a cooling effect even when there's a small amount of water. So let's take it step by step again. Number 1, how does this function relate to its structure? So first, This is very similar to the high specific heat capacity explanation. So it takes a lot of energy to break the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules, even a tiny amount of water. So when that tiny amount of water then evaporates, it will provide a cooling effect. What is the biological function this relates to? Think of sweating. So when you sweat, actually is only a tiny amount of water that is being released from your body. What happens is when the water evaporates off your body, it has a cooling effect because it's taking some of the heat off your body with it. So the final function of water that I want to discuss is that water is a metabolite itself. What do I mean by this? So far we've just spoke about how water is essentially a good host for other biological activities and biological molecules occurring in the body. But water is also involved in some of these chemical reactions as well. So we can categorize these into two different types, hydrolysis and condensation. Hydrolysis quite literally means breaking water, so hydrolysis. And condensation, I'm sure you probably know, condensation is a release of water. Hydrolysis, to break with water, is a reaction where a water molecule is used in the reaction. So a water molecule is lost to the reaction, and condensation is a reaction where a molecule is produced in a reaction. So this leads nicely to the next section where I want to discuss monomers and polymers. But before I do, let's just do a quick recap of water. So water consists of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, and they share electrons. However, the sharing of electrons is unequal, meaning that the molecule has 2 poles, aka it's polar, whereby the hydrogen is more positive and the oxygen is more negative. These polar regions form bonds called hydrogen bonds. This makes water molecules very sticky, both to itself, which we refer to as cohesion, and to other molecules referred to as adhesion. Its other properties include the fact that it's a solvent, meaning substances can dissolve in water because of its ability to form hydrogen bonds. This makes it a location for metabolic reactions and an excellent transport medium. It has a high specific heat capacity, meaning it can keep temperatures very stable. And finally, it has a relatively large latent heat of vaporization. And this means that when water is evaporated, it takes a lot of the heat and therefore has a cooling effect. And these are all properties which make water essential to life. Now I want to introduce you to the concept of monomers and polymers. So mono means single or one, and poly means there are multiple. I want you to think about a train. So a train is made up of multiple carriages. So the single carriage in this analogy would be called a monomer, and it's a one component of a bigger structure, and the train therefore is the polymer. So it's made up of multiple monomers or carriages, and that forms the whole train. So why am I talking about trains? Most of the biological molecules we're going to be looking at, so carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, work in the same way. So they are made up of chains of smaller identical components, monomers, to form a larger molecule, which is then the polymer. So another analogy would be a human chain. So imagine a long line of people holding hands. Each individual person would be the monomer, and then the whole chain is the polymer. So I spoke briefly about hydrolysis and condensation reactions, and that would lead us into monomers and polymers. This is because monomers can be joined together by condensation reactions. A water molecule is lost when 2 monomers join together and form a bond, and then the reverse is also true. So hydrolysis, as I said, means to break with water, and this is where water is added to break a chemical bond between 2 molecules, resulting in, for example, 2 monomers. So to summarize, monomers are small units which are the components of larger molecules. Polymers are molecules made from many monomers joined together. Now, broadly speaking, the biological molecules we will be studying can also be split into organic and inorganic. And I just wanted to clarify what is meant by organic, because in popular language now, organic tends to mean something to do with like how your fruit and veg is grown. But what it literally means in biology is that something is carbon based. So some examples which we're going to be learning about are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And it's actually helpful to know off the top of your head which elements are within each of these biological molecules. And you will be learning the structure of carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids individually. But sometimes you do tend to forget the specific elements involved. So just to go through that and clarify, so you can nail it down in your heads, because they do sometimes ask these questions in exams. Carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids are also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. For proteins, they are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And then nucleic acids, you have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphates. And I will just make a quick note about proteins as well. You can have some other elements involved in proteins, which you will learn about in the protein lesson. Okay, so those are the organic molecules, which we're going to learn about. So what about the inorganic molecules? These, as I mentioned, are biological molecules which are not carbon-based, many of which are also ions. So just to refresh your memory, an ion is a charged molecule. And I'm sure if you could answer me and I asked you if you can think of some examples of inorganic ions in the body, you would name a couple. The most common answer I usually get is calcium. So calcium, or Ca2+, is very important for our bones and teeth, for example. And inorganic ions, they occur throughout the body in solution in the cytoplasm and body fluids of organisms, some in high concentration and some in very low concentrations. And there are a couple of more examples in addition to calcium you need to know about. And you can split these into positively charged inorganic ions, also referred to as cations, or negatively charged inorganic ions, or anions. So some examples of cations, so those are the positively charged inorganic ions, things like calcium, as I just mentioned, sodium, potassium, hydrogen, ammonium. Anions include nitrates, chloride, phosphate, hydroxide. And each type of ion has a specific role depending on its properties. I'm not going to go through every single one now, as they do tend to come up throughout the module or later in the year, and I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information where you're just having to list the inorganic ions and remember each of their functions. But some of them are probably things you already know. For example, you know that hydrogen is important for maintaining a pH. Iron is needed for hemoglobin. Sodium ions are involved in co-transport. As I mentioned, calcium you need for your healthy bones and healthy teeth. And for some of you, you may also need to understand the role of some of these specifically in plants. So they can ask you specifically for a role of, for example, nitrates in plants, not just in animals. And I will point out which exam boards need to know that in the additional lessons where we go over exam questions or in the revision sessions. If you are only listening to the free lessons, I'm sure you can ask your teacher whether you need to know that, or even check the specification yourself, or even the textbook if you have one. So one example I am going to go over now is phosphate, and that's because it has a crucial role in the structure of another biological molecule you need to know about called ATP. I don't want you to get too worried about the function as of yet, as it comes up in bigger detail later on into the A-level syllabus. Firstly, let's just understand the structure of ATP. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. You can also get ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So the triphosphate, there are 3 phosphates, diphosphate, 2 phosphates. And there are 3 major components of the structure of ATP. You have an adenine group, a ribose group, and then 3 phosphate groups. And it's important for you to know visually how it is structured as well, because you can be asked to label ATP. So ATP is our energy currency. So don't worry too much yet about how ATP is generating energy. All we want to learn at this stage is the structure, the adenine, the ribose, 3 phosphate groups, and you can lose a phosphate group by hydrolysis. So when ATP is hydrolyzed to form ADP and a phosphate molecule, it releases energy. And the energy comes from the bonds between the phosphate molecules being broken. The bonds are very unstable, and so they have a low activation energy, so they're very easy to break. And when the inorganic phosphate is released during the hydrolysis of ATP, it can be used to phosphorylate other compounds, often making them more reactive. And then finally, ATP can also be resynthesized. So the phosphate group can be re-added by a condensation reaction, so where a water molecule is released, and this reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme called ATP synthase. So once again, we then want to relate the structure to the function, same as we've done with water. Properties of ATP. Number 1, it is an immediate source of energy. How does that relate to its structure? So as I just said, the bonds between the phosphate groups are very weak, which means they can be broken very easily and you get a quick release. And then the other advantage of ATP is that we don't need to store a large quantity of ATP. And this is because we can transition between ATP and ADP very quickly. And every time that reaction occurs, we get a release of energy. So you have one ATP molecule, you release the phosphate group, you get X amount of energy. But then that ATP molecule can then be reformed and you can repeat the process again. So I know this is a lot of information to absorb in 30 minutes, but obviously this is on demand, so you can pause and rewind and re-listen. I actually do recommend that you probably listen in chunks over an hour instead, and make some notes in between and make sure you're fully understanding before you move on to the next section. So that is all that we are going to cover for today. So we covered water, its structure, its properties, and how those properties relate to its function. Secondly, we covered the basis of monomers and polymers. We went over some inorganic ions and ATP. And once again, I really do encourage you to join me in the follow-up lesson where we're going to be going over some exam questions. And at the end, I'll also be setting a essay-style exam question, which, depending on if you are a subscriber, I will be marking and returning to you within the week. If not, I will be going over that exam question at the beginning of the lesson next week. So thank you so much for listening. Remember, you can access additional content on our Patreon page by searching for Equity Tutors, where we have a second 30-minute lesson every week, plus monthly bonus content. You can also find us on most social media platforms. We will keep you updated on new content, and you can find us there by searching for Equity Tutors UK. Please like, share, subscribe and comment wherever you are listening, and if you're enjoying, please leave a review. Bye!
Bye!